not able to have any new or material information out there. So with a private company, it would be the same thing, right? You circulate your PPM, and in the private placement memorandum, you have all relevant facts, okay? And when you have all relevant facts in a document, you can't have a new relevant fact being created after the PPM was created, but before the transaction is consummated, okay? So you have this quiet period where you're really not able to do anything significant. You can still sell your product. You can still have normal ongoing operations. But if you had your CFO quit, what? You'd have to stop, refile your documents, okay? If all of a sudden you did a deal, you agree that you're now going to sell your product in Europe, and you had a distribution agreement with a big European company, you have to stop and refile your document, okay? And a famous example of the quiet period being violated is Google. The young guys at Google gave an interview with Playboy magazine. And being young, soon-to-be billionaires, they thought Playboy was kind of a fun magazine to do an interview with. And they answered all the questions that the interviewer asked. And there were questions like, well, gee, how are things going? And they said, oh, things are going great. You know, we're just adding this new feature to the website, and I think that sales are going like this, and I think that development is going like that. And the lawyers looked at it and went, you said things in the interview that we didn't say in the S1. And Google got all defensive. They said, we do not believe our involvement in the Playboy magazine article constitutes a violation of Section 5 of the Securities Act of 1933. And they just got caught red-handed. So the banks that were involved, it was Credit Suisse and Morgan Stanley, I believe. You know, big, huge organizations. In the end, there are a few little grunts, you know, guys in their 20s out of business school that are involved in, you know, these documents. And they were trying to figure out how to get the transaction through, right? Because you just had this new material event come out, which was this interview with the opinions of the management team. So it was some brilliant young kid, you know, a banking analyst, who came up with the idea of put Playboy magazine into the S1. And now all the investors can have equal information, right? So here is the Google S1. And no, there are no pictures of naked ladies in here. But they did, they bought the rights to the article from Playboy, and they just put it right into the S1. So here's an S1. And like a law or like a federal regulation, it is a long and unwieldy thing, okay? And when you go through an IPO, everyone has to get a copy of this. It generally comes, it's called red herring, right? It's got the red strip down the left side. And very rarely would I, anyways, when I was doing IPOs, would you ever read something like this. Instead, what the bankers would bring along would be a PowerPoint slide version, right? And technically, you're not able to do that, right? Because the only information you can show to an investor is that information or document that the SEC is signing off on. And that's why whenever you do an IPO roadshow, they always gather the slides back from you. Say, oh, I can't leave this with you, right? Because technically it's illegal. But it's common practice. Everyone gets a copy of the PowerPoints. If you ever ask a lawyer about it, they say, oh, well, it's just information that was included in the S1, which is nonsense. But this is about how things go. And so, anyways, I encourage you to take a look through the Google S1. And again, this is how public companies do it. A small public company will do something like an S1, but just a smaller version of it. And a private company, okay, will do a PPM. And again, we'll discuss those in the next section. But the principle remains the same. You have this awkward period of time where you've created the PPM, and you're distributing the PPM so that you're trying to get investors. And you really can't have anything new come along during the period of time between when the PPM is created and the deal is consummated. So, now, let's go take a look at the exemptions, okay? How can you get out of having to file statements with the SEC? So most public companies, they go public by filing Form S1. The SEC deems the S1 effective, okay? For 25 days before the SEC deemed the S1 effective, the company's out there, you know, showing it around to investors. And once it's effective, then you can start taking money from investors. That generally takes a few days. The deal gets done. The bank collects the money. The bank issues the shares, and 93% of the money, generally the banks are taking a 7% fee, gets kicked back to the company for those shares, right? So the bank's kind of the middleman. The major piece of legislation that we'll focus on is the congressional legislation having to do with the Securities Act of 1933, the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, the Investment Companies Act of 1940, the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, and the Sarbanes-Oxley. These are part of what is referred to as the U.S. Code. Under SEC rules, we will review Rule 147, Rule 505, and Rule 506. So is everyone here familiar with the difference between the U.S. Code and the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations? Okay. The U.S. Code is basically a book or a document which contains all the laws that are passed by Congress. The U.S. Code of Federal Regulations is basically, well, now it's a database, but in the old days it was a physical book, which are all the regulations passed by the White House or agencies like the SEC that report to the White House. As a matter of constitutional law in the United States, a law passed by Congress trumps a regulation passed by a branch of reporting exemptions. If the company has fewer than 300 shareholders, okay, you don't have to report. And if the company has less than 10 million in assets and less than 500 shareholders, you also don't have to report. But these are situations where maybe you file with the Securities and Exchange Commission to go public, okay? And it turns out that after the offering you have fewer than 300 shareholders, you don't have to make the quarterly filings. But if you have more than 300, okay, and over 10 million, then you've got to file quarterly the 10Q and annually the 10K. And anytime you have a material event, you have to file an 8K. If you have under the 300, you don't have to do that. And the way this law is written, that is why it's so difficult in the United States to unbecome a public company. All right, you've heard about companies going private. This is the hurdle with 300 shareholders. Okay. Now, the problem becomes if you start losing money, then you have to have less than 500, right? So it's a little bit easier. But still, once your stock's trading, you really have a hard time controlling how many shareholders you have. Let's say you bought, 10,000 shares in the IPO, and you put up, you say, I want to sell my shares. Now let's say you sell 2,000 to her, 5,000 to him, and 3,000 to him. Now my company has gone from having 1 shareholder to 3 shareholders. So it's really kind of difficult, right, to control how many shareholders you have. And it's not like you can go out there as the company and say, all right, I have 305 shareholders, but you guys each only have 100 shares. So I'll go out and cut a special deal with you guys, right, to buy your shares back for more, because that'll get me under the 300 threshold. No, now you're dealing your shareholders unequally, right? You're offering to buy the shares for more, right, from the guys who only have 100 apiece, so you can broach this threshold. So this is one of the things that makes foreign companies especially uncomfortable with registering with the SEC, is that if you register with the SEC and you say, well, you know what, our company isn't doing as well as we thought. We initially registered with the SEC because we wanted to access the U.S. markets. We added on the additional costs of, we have to now pay accountants to do our numbers in U.S. GAAP, right? Got to come over to New York and got to do road shows. We've really had a setback. We really just rely on the European markets for our investor base. Thank you very much. Sorry we registered. We registered with the SEC. You're stuck. Like being married. Can't get out of it, right? Hopefully my wife is not watching this. So, exemptions from registration. We discussed this before. And basically what you have here is an act that was written in 1933 by an administration, which by the way was also passing a lot of the legislation in areas outside of financial services. This legislation got rushed through, and one of the major problems they made with the Securities Act of 1933 was an underlying assumption that most companies were going to be registered with the SEC. It's not the case, wasn't the case then, certainly isn't the case after Sarbanes-Oxley.